Well, welcome again, class. I'm your instructor, Tom Mahoney. This is another lecture in Advanced Aircraft Systems, specifically lecture number 5. The title today is Why We Use Pressurization. This is not actually a systems module. It's not found in your AeroSim. This is something I've made up just so we could get a good understanding of what the reason we have pressurization for on our aircraft. So let's get started. We'll start out with the composition of the atmosphere. For dry air, percent by volume, the air is made up of 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. And there's 1% of other gases. I don't care about that stuff. It doesn't matter that much, unless, of course, it's a poisonous gas. But these are not. So 1% CO2, argon, xenon, and so forth. The composition stays the same regardless of the altitude we are at on Earth. So if I'm standing on the beach down in Florida, the composition of the air is still 98% and 21%. If I'm standing on top of Mount Audubon out near Ward, Colorado, at 13,000 feet, the composition remains the same, 98% nitrogen, and 21% oxygen. A little harder to breathe because the density of that air at 13,000 feet is quite a bit less than the density of the air at sea level. Let's talk about what the atmospheres are that we're living in as humans. The atmosphere next to the Earth is called the troposphere. The troposphere extends upward to about 36,000 feet at the middle latitudes, in other words, around the equator, and less at the poles, and as I said, more at the equator. Temperature decreases linearly with altitude up to about 36,000 feet. This is where we get our standard lapse rate that you've probably heard when you were going through your private pilot training. So let's just take a look here at the picture. I'm going to go ahead and bring this out just a little bit. There we go. Come on back here to the right picture, right slide. There we are. So as you can see, we've got the Earth right here in the middle, and surrounding the Earth is the troposphere. It's egg-shaped. It goes up higher at the equator, less at the poles. And then the little blue line around it is called the tropopause, and the area outside the tropopause is called the stratosphere. Sometimes we fly in the stratosphere, sometimes we're always going to be in the troposphere at one point or another when we're taking off and climbing out. And eventually, if we get high enough, we'll be in the stratosphere. And the mesosphere and all this other stuff we don't care about unless we're going to be astronauts, and that's not the case for this class. So why do we want to fly high? Well, that doesn't mean we're going to be smoking something funny. We're going to actually be at a higher altitude, but we can get the same effects at the higher altitude. If you're going to be smoking something funny, you can get euphoric and have a good time. But why do we want to fly high? Because the primary purpose is that we get better fuel efficiency in a turbojet or a turbofan type of aircraft. They just burn a lot less fuel at higher altitudes. So if we had to fly at a lower altitude, we're going to burn more fuel. If we were planned at a higher altitude, we would plan our fuel burn at that altitude. And if we had to drop down for some reason, we better make sure we have enough fuel to make our destination. So fuel efficiency is a big thing for flying at a higher altitude. In addition to that, we have less drag because the air is less dense. So therefore, the aircraft can travel forward at a much higher true airspeed compared to indicated airspeed. Additionally, we fly above most adverse weather when we're very high. Less adverse weather is found at the higher altitudes above 30,000 feet. Only the tops of thunderstorms reach that high, making them easy to see and avoid. And the temperature is too cold for icing. So as far as commercial airliners go, we're much more efficient flying at higher altitudes, better chance of getting to our destination without weather being a factor until we actually start the descent and approach into the airport. Why is atmospheric pressure necessary? Well, the loss of atmospheric pressure results in a lower concentration of oxygen in the bloodstream. This has many subtle effects on human performance. Our lungs are designed to absorb oxygen directly into the bloodstream, but can only do so by using atmospheric pressure to literally force the oxygen into the lung membranes and then have the oxygen carried into the bloodstream. So if we have no atmospheric pressure, doesn't matter how much we suck in, the lungs, the membranes in the lungs can't absorb the oxygen and place the oxygen into the bloodstream. Just can't do it. The lower levels of oxygen has a medical term. You've probably heard this before. It's called hypoxia. Okay. Well, there are 4 different types of hypoxia. We'll talk about that. But we have a need for an abundance of oxygen in our bloodstream. That's because we're human. That's the way we developed through the ages. So combined with food products, the oxygen is a source of heat and energy for our muscles and our brain. The effects of the lack of oxygen, gradually diminishing performance, physically and mentally. Logical thinking deteriorates, thought process becomes confused, night vision diminishes, and tunnel vision usually occurs. And we get this euphoric feeling, and we feel pretty good about it. My symptoms are usually thought process becomes confused. So sometimes, even here, sitting in my living room, I apparently have a need for oxygen because I'm sometimes very confused. 4 types of hypoxia. We have hypoxic, hyphenic, stagnant, and hystoxic. They all are a little bit different. They all kind of affect us in as different ways. But for example, hypoxia is the one that we as pilots think of as being the most common. It's the result of having a low air pressure and unable to absorb oxygen into our lungs. It happens at high altitudes, and the one that we typically think of as pilots. There is hyphenic hypoxia. That is a low concentration of O2 in the molecules of the blood. Even if there's enough oxygen in the air, we might not be able to get enough oxygen into our cells. A case of this would be of concern to pilots when we are getting carbon monoxide. If you're in a little light aircraft, if you know how the heater on those things work, there's actually a shroud wrapped around the exhaust pipes of the aircraft. If those exhaust pipes get a little leak in them, then we're actually getting carbon monoxide pumped into our heater shroud, which then pumps that carbon monoxide directly into the cabin, and can be pretty serious. I've known a couple individuals who have died as a result of carbon monoxide, and just one of those things that comes on very subtle. That's why we have carbon monoxide indicators in the cockpit. I'm a big believer in that because you're probably not going to recognize the onset of carbon monoxide poison. And of course, we have stagnant hypoxia. That's the restriction of blood flow. So what can happen is you can be having a heart attack and your heart muscles not pumping oxygen through your body effectively. And that's considered to be stagnant hypoxia. If you put a tourniquet up around your arm, cut the blood off, going to the rest of your arm, that is also considered stagnant hypoxia. Not something we necessarily worry so much about in an airplane. If we're in good health, generally we shouldn't be having heart attacks, hopefully, unless they just pop up on us. But that's why we do our medicals. That's why we have EKGs at a certain age, and we try to avoid stagnant hypoxia in that manner. Hystoxic hypoxia is basically a poisoning in the blood, in the tissues that interferes with the transfer of blood from the blood to the brain. Alcohol can do this to you. Okay, so that's why we don't drink alcohol before we fly. Try to stay sober. The rule of 8 hours bottle to throttle. Another thing that can cause this to occur is cyanide. If you get cyanide poisoning, hystoxic hypoxia can result. And then this is the reason we have requirements on the types of plastics we use in airplanes. If you have an aircraft fire in flight and the plastic around you starts to burn, the fumes given off by that plastic can also be a form of poisoning and result in hystoxic hypoxia. So if you want to learn more about that, go to the website listed below here, FAA Gov Pilots Training Airmen Education to PICS and interest related to hypoxia. That's a really good document to review, especially if you're going for your CFI and you want to know more about this. You're liable to get asked what are the 4 different types of hypoxia. That particular website will give you a lot of good information that you can provide to your DPE when they're interviewing you for your advanced ratings. Let's talk about the time of useful consciousness. Data taken from the U.S. Air Force physiological studies applied to male and female subjects in good health and fit for flight. So these are your military type pilots we're talking about. So most of us aren't that fit. I know I'm not that fit anymore. I'm still in pretty good shape, but so I'm going to view these numbers with that in mind. What kind of shape am I in compared to what kind of shape the subjects were that they tested? So they put them into a altitude chamber, pumped out the atmosphere to some degree, lowered the atmospheric pressure, and watched what the results were. And this is what they came up with. Between 12 and 18,000 feet, you have about 30 minutes or more of useful consciousness. If you're at 28,000 feet, that drops down to about 2.5 minutes. If you're at 30,000 feet, where we typically fly airliners above 30,000 feet, we have about a minute to 2 minutes of useful consciousness. And at 40,000 feet, towards the upper end of our operating envelope, we have about 15 to 20 seconds. Not a lot of time to get that quick donning oxygen mask on that we probably have sitting next to us. It seems like enough because we're supposed to be able to get that quick donning oxygen mask on in 5 seconds. But what happens at 40,000 feet when you have rapid decompression is the air fills with fog and you get some confusion. And the next thing you know, 15 seconds has gone right by and you haven't got your oxygen mask on. Because let's say you're wearing glasses, you try to put the oxygen mask on, and the glasses are in the way. The next thing you know, you got to take your glasses off, then get your oxygen mask on. And by then it may be too late. We do not fly often above 40,000 feet. There are some special requirements for doing so. And I have been at 42,000 feet. That was the max altitude, I believe, on the 737 that I was flying. So one of us had to wear an oxygen mask. At 50,000 feet, you don't have any time at all. Let's just face it. You're not going to get a quick donning oxygen mask on in less than 5 seconds. It just takes longer unless you practice it routinely and you're not taken by surprise in a rapid decompression. So, preventing hypoxia. There are 2 ways to prevent hypoxia when flying at high altitudes. The first way is to increase the atmospheric pressure around you. In other words, pressurize the cabin. The second way is to increase the percent of oxygen in the air being breathed. So we talked about normally we have 21% oxygen in the air. So if we supplement that and pack in more oxygen, make it 50% oxygen in the air, we're going to be able to survive much better at higher altitudes, breathing oxygen in that form. So let's talk about aircraft cabin pressurization. The solution to high altitude flight is to surround the human body with air pressure near that of sea level. What that's going to do is help our lungs absorb the oxygen that's in the air that when we take it into our lungs so that it can be pressed through the membranes of the lungs on into the bloodstream. Two methods to do that. Install the body into a pressure suit like the astronauts have, or the U-2 pilots are flying around with pressure suits because they're flying well above 40,000 feet. 50 to 60,000 feet normal flight altitudes for those guys. They don't have time to put an oxygen mask on, so they're going to sit in a pressure suit. And then they also, for those guys, actually partially pressurize the cockpit that they're sitting in. The other way to do it is pressurize the interior of the aircraft to a lower altitude. And experience is showing that a cabin altitude of about 8,000 feet works really well. Lower than that for any time that you're going to spend in flight of more than an hour. And we have FAR 91 specifies the actual oxygen requirements above 12,500 MSL, not cabin pressure altitude, but actual indicated altitude. And it is summarized on the next pages. So we're trying to get the cabin pressure altitude down to and remain within 8,000 feet. That's the kind of the accepted level throughout the industry. Well, let's talk about FAR 91.211A oxygen requirements. So let's start at the bottom down here. Let me bring my little pin up. I like that pin right there. I've got that in my hand now. So we're going to talk about 12,000 feet, 12,500 foot or below 12,500 feet. No oxygen requirements. We can fly along in an unpressurized aircraft. Should have no ill effects below 12,500. However, when we are operating in this range, between 12,500 and 14,000 feet, the flight crew must always use oxygen when they're at those altitudes for more than 30 minutes. If we are going to be flying between 14,000 feet and below 15,000 feet, the flight crew must use oxygen for the duration of the flight. This of course is an unpressurized aircraft, so this is what you're going to be doing in your Cessna 172. Since it's unpressurized, you should have oxygen always being using it above 14,000 feet to 15,000 feet. Above 15,000 feet becomes a little bit more complicated. The flight crew must, of course, always use oxygen, but now oxygen must be provided to the other occupants of the aircraft. So do they have to use it? No, they're not at the controls, but it must be made available to them. Of course, you know this from your private pilot training. You know all these rules, I'm sure. So FAR 91 211B requirements for a pressurized aircraft. So now we're no longer in a non-pressurized aircraft, but we're in a pressurized aircraft. So when we're flying the aircraft above 25,000 feet indicated altitude, a 10-minute supply of oxygen is available to each occupant in addition to the oxygen required by 91 211B. If we're going to fly the aircraft above 35,000 feet, one pilot must wear an oxygen mask unless two pilots are at the controls and they each have a quick donning oxygen mask. So in the airlines, typically speaking now, they pretty much all have quick donning masks. So pilots are not required to wear the mask if there's both pilots in the flight deck at the same time, and each pilot has a quick donning mask So that's above 35,000 feet. If so, they can fly up to flight level 410 before one pilot must wear a mask. So been up there once, I think, above 41,000 feet. One of us wore a mask. And, we don't like really doing that. So very seldom do you ever see an airline uh, operation going above 41,000 feet. Pilots just don't like wearing masks that much. So we make sure that we stay down below 41,000 feet most of the time. The exception to this is if one pilot leaves the flight deck, the other pilot must wear an oxygen mask. So for physiological need, one pilot gets up, has to go to the lavatory. At that time, of course, we would bring a flight attendant in to keep us company so that they can unlock the door, let the other guy back in through, various stuff I can't tell you about because you don't have the secret handshake. But of course, one pilot sitting up there by himself and he's got the oxygen mask on, flight attendant sitting back behind him. Of course, you want to have a conversation, so you're always doing this. Hey, how's it going back there today? Are the passengers all behaving well, etc.? And when you go back, can you hand me a Dr. Pepper? I'd like a Dr. Pepper before we lock the door. So you're always picking that mask up, but you're always making sure if something happens, it's right over your face. So you've adhered to the requirements. So the definition of a quick donning mask is simply a mask that can be put on with one hand in less than 5 seconds. Not as easy as you think. I did this training one year and I just started wearing glasses when I was flying. And of course they said, okay, boom, depressurization. I grabbed that quick donning mask. I reached up and I started to put it on. The next thing I know, my glasses go down. They're in the way. And I'm sitting there going, oh, crud. And I threw my glasses across the cockpit and then got the mask on. And then suddenly realized I've got to come up with a better solution of getting an oxygen mask on because I was wearing glasses. So now my routine is, okay, quick rapid decompression, take my glasses off, reach over, and then put the mask on. So I learned, make sure I take my glasses off or I'm going to knock them off my face anyway. So that was the lesson I learned about quick donning mask. So the pressurization theory is simple. All you're trying to do is seal the cabin and the cockpit areas relatively well against air loss. That doesn't mean it's perfectly sealed. You pump in pressurized air into the cabin until the pressure inside equals the desired cabin pressure altitude to represent something 8,000 feet or below. Let the airflow out of the control valve so that some air goes out of the control valve so that air continuously circulates through the cabin. The pressurized air should be cooled and heated as required, and if necessary, humidity added for a comfortable cabin environment. So the higher you go, the drier the air gets. Sometimes it can get really dry, and over a long period of long flight, the aircraft may have some sort of humidification system built into their packs that we've talked about. So that's why we use our packs. The air conditioning system is actually how we pump warm or cold air into the cabin, and pumping that air in using pack pressure helps create the pressurization of the pressure vessel, or another way of saying the cabin or the cockpit. So the pressurized aircraft use what we call a pressure vessel, easy for you guys to say, pressure vessel, and that's what we call the cabin that we are sitting in. The term developed by engineers. The cabin is designed to be a controlled leak, so air is always going to be leaking out. The question is, can we pump enough air into it fast enough to be able to control the altitude, cabin altitude, and maintain it 8,000 foot or below as an altitude that we can operate and function in as humans more effectively. Okay, so small size, medium to small size aircraft typically have one pressure vessel, and larger aircraft have possibly multiple vessels. One, would be a cabin. The next might be the baggage compartment, another area, the equipment area. So, the bigger you go, the more vessels you have inside the aircraft. Pressurized aircraft stresses. This is actually what caused the life expectancy of a jet aircraft to be decreased. Each time an aircraft is pressurized, the vessel fuselage expands slightly, and not so much like a balloon, but just a little bit, and then contracts when it's depressurized. In other words, just before landing, the aircraft will be depressurized, and that is called a pressurization cycle. Airframes have limited lifetimes depending on how many pressurization cycles they've experienced, independent of how many hours the aircraft actually flies. So very often, the aircraft isn't taken out to the desert park because of how many hours it has on it. It's more a factor of how many times has it been pressurized and unpressurized. Airframes with high cycles must have more frequent inspections and maintenances or be retired. When the typical flights are short, less than an hour or less, and the airframe is pressurized for each flight, stress on the airframe accumulates quickly. Many such flights may be made every day, adding cycles faster than hours. After thousands of hours of pressurization cycles, the metal can become fatigued and fail. So this is the reason we have aircraft ending up out in the desert, eventually being melted down so that we can have our 4th of July parties and drink our Dr. Pepper in an aluminum can. So they make aluminum cans out of recycled aluminum. This is what happens if we get too many cycles on an aircraft and we do not take it out of service at the appropriate time. So this was Honolulu, or let's see, a flight that on a 737 at 24,000 feet over the Hawaiian Islands back in 1998, where the top literally blew off right behind the cockpit and the over the forward section of the cabin. Remarkably, only one person lost their life. It was a flight attendant who got sucked out of the top, and they never did find the body. But this is a lesson to be learned at Southwest Airlines. We call the early 737s pop tops for this very reason. The spacing on the rivets apparently weren't tight enough or close enough. So the number of cycles the early 737s was limited due to much more limited than later 737s. So this is not so much of a problem, but I've flown with captains before when I first got to Southwest that were afraid to take the aircraft above 37,000 feet. So because of this, so they were pretty cautious. They were scaredy cats for a good reason. Sudden decompression. What about a bullet hole in the side of your 737 at 33,000 feet? That going to make much of a difference? Yeah, we'll talk about it. A hole may be 0.3 to 0.4 inches in diameter. Probably not going to be a problem. The outflow at the back, outflow valve at the back of the aircraft on the bulkheads, just going to squeeze down just a little bit more, make sure that pressurization can be maintained. But what if the whole window or baggage hatch blew out? That might be a different story. And that's what it would look like. So as you can see on this aircraft, 747, right down in this area, that's where some seats were. Those seats are no longer there. Those people are no longer there. This was a little more catastrophic. And of course, bags flew out because this is the baggage hall down here. And apparently on this aircraft, what happened is the baggage door was not properly closed or sealed, and somehow it came open, or the material around it became loose and it ripped it off, ripping the skin right up right up into the passenger compartment. So losing a big part of the fuselage, such as a window or baggage compartment door, can and does have catastrophic consequences. Rapid decompression of the cabin or baggage area will result the air will chill to minus 40 degrees in just a few seconds. So minus 40 degrees, that's pretty cold. I'm not wearing my electric jacket up there at those altitudes, so my hands are going to get numb real quick just from the temperature. All the moisture in the air is going to instantaneously uh, become frozen and create a very dense fog to the effect that pilots cannot even see the panel when they're flying. So this is the shock factor you're going to have with a rapid decompression at high altitudes. You're not going to be able to see anything. And now think about trying to get that oxygen mask on and having to take your glasses off. So things are going to be kind of in a temporarily panic situation, uh, at the very least confusing. It can get extremely noisy. There's going to be mass confusion, panic among the passengers are going to occur. The pressure will drop to maybe 2.1 psi per square inch, when normally we'd like to have it around 8 to 8.6. No one can breathe or catch their breath because it's going to literally feel like it's sucking the air right out of your lungs for until the pressure equalizes. Of course, shortly thereafter, you're going to become hypoxic if you don't get oxygen. And unless the aircraft is lowered to 15,000 feet as soon as possible, all occupants will die either from suffocation or hypothermia within just a few minutes. And you remember the story about the Ligoffer, and he was in I believe it was a Learjet. They had a malfunctioning outflow valve, I think is what it was. They took off. Pretty insidious. The pressure was dropping. Nobody recognized it. The next thing they knew, they passed out from hypoxia. And when they flew up alongside the aircraft as it was cruising at a high altitude, the fighter jet flew up alongside of it. They could see the pilots in the cockpit were kind of just sitting there, maybe a little bit slumped over. But for the most part, the windows were all fogged over and iced over. So there wasn't, so they knew at that point in time, obviously this aircraft was flying on its own, and the passengers, the pilots had already become deceased. Of course, that aircraft, I think, became a lawn dart out there somewhere in Wyoming, if I remember correctly. Anyway, cabin pressure differential. This is a concept you need to understand. You'll be using this at higher altitudes, especially if you're operating on manual pressurization. You need to know what this means. Difference in pressure between the inside and the outside of the cabin atmosphere. So the example of this is atmospheric pressure in the cabin at 8,000 feet. So you've got your cabin pressure at 8,000 feet. You're cruising along at 40,000 feet. So the cabin pressure is exerting 10.916 pounds per square inch against the sidewalls of the aircraft from the inside out. Atmospheric pressure outside the aircraft at 40,000 feet is 2.72 pounds per square inch, pushing in on the cockpit. The difference, pressure differential then, of course, is 10.92 minus 2.72 equals the differential pressure of 8.2. So the cabin interior pressure is pushing out at about 8.2 psi in terms of when it's all set up and done. That's how much pressure that the cockpit and the flight deck or the cabin is actually pushing outward, holding, pushing out, trying to burst the aircraft open. 8.2 is not as much as you think it is, except when you start calculating from an engineering point of view in this manner. If the cabin has a surface area of 10,000 square inches, the structure will have 82,000 pounds of pressure inside of it that it's trying to contain, same as 41 tons of pressure to contain. So keep that in mind, what the cabin pressurization differential is, and we can typically fly around at about 8.2, fairly safe in these aircraft. So let's think about it this way: cabin pressure differential required for different altitudes. So let's say we're trying to hold the cabin altitude at 8,000 feet. That's 10.916 psi. The differential pressure at different altitudes will be this. At 18,000 feet, the differential pressure will be 3.577. At 40,000 feet, it's going to be a differential pressure of 8.196. Still pretty safe, 8.2. We're under that. I feel pretty good. If we go to 45,000 feet, which we will not do in a commercial airliner, at least the ones I'm familiar with, the pressure differential would be 8.777. That's a cause for alarm. If we go up to 51,000 feet, because these aircraft can do it, they have the engine power to get us up there. The aircraft's probably limited to what the max differential pressure can be. At 51,000 feet, the differential pressure with an 8,000 foot cabin would be 9.313. And then we might be getting ourselves into, well, we could just call ourselves test pilots at that point in time. So, automatic pressure relief valve. This is just a pop-off safety valve so that we don't over-pressurize the aircraft. So, if we get above like an 8,000 foot pressure cabin or above 8.6 pressure differential, we have a pop-off valve that opens up, relieves the internal pressure, takes some pressure out. That would be like opening the valve on a pressure tank so that the pressure tank doesn't explode. So that's what the pressure relief valve is. Then we have the outflow valve, and that's our primary valve that controls the pressurization inside the aircraft. It's usually at the bulkhead, and that'll modulate closed the higher we go in altitude. So once we hit 8,000 feet, the outflow valve might still be pretty much open. Once we climb the aircraft above an indicated altitude, 8,000 feet, we're going to try to maintain a cabin pressure altitude of 8,000 feet. So when we get to 10,000 feet, the outflow valve has started to close, holding that cabin pressure altitude at 8,000 feet. And as we climb on up to altitude, the valve closes more and more so that when we're up to 40,000 feet, the valve is almost virtually closed. So there's not a lot of air escaping the aircraft. It's probably more being recirculated at that point in time. That's what an outflow valve looks like. I've never actually seen one, never held one in my hands, never touched one in 20 years. We just kind of know that it's back there. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to pressurize the aircraft and hold the selected pressurization at a value that is comfortable. But that's what it looks like. And we can move on. So let's talk about what a negative pressure relief valve is. So we have a positive pressure relief valve that lets air pressure out of our cabin so that we don't explode the cabin. But so what happens if we get too much air pressure on the outside of the cabin? Well, here's what happens. I've got my little pop can right here. You see it? There it is. If we don't have a negative pressure relief valve, this is what happens. So we've got to have a negative pressure relief valve to keep our pressure vessel from collapsing. When would this happen? Well, in the movies, it happens when the aircraft lands in the water, sinks to the bottom of the ocean. We would have excessive pressure outside, and it would collapse the fuselage, except that does never happen in the movies. So just take that with a grain of salt. I can almost guarantee you the aircraft might drift down to the bottom, and before you can really tell, a bunch of water is going to be coming in and filling up the cabin. That might keep the cabin from collapsing, because then the water pressure is going to equalize inside and out, but won't really help you. You're going to, unless you're on oxygen, of course, you got to put that oxygen mask on and breathe through that oxygen mask. Yeah, not likely. The dump valve is actually named, the actual valve is named a safety relief valve or manual depressurization valve. Manual control is from the flight deck, and we can use the dump valve in an emergency situation. For example, we get smoke in the cockpit, then we might have to go ahead and vacate that smoke by doing a manual depressurization by opening the dump valve. So that would get the smoke out of the cockpit, at least for the time being. So that's it. That's all I've got to say about this. Pressurization uses air from the air conditioning system. It all starts at the engines. So let's review the basic principles. Oxygen in the air is about 21% of the total volume at all flight altitudes. To maintain oxygen to the lungs requires atmospheric pressure. Air enters the cabin from the air conditioning system. When the cabin doors and windows are closed, the cabin becomes a pressure vessel. The pressure is controlled by an outflow valve, normally towards the rear of the pressure vessel. Normally, for most commercial aircraft, the maximum cabin altitude should not exceed 8,000 feet. The maximum differential outside air pressure to inside pressure should not exceed 8.6 psi to be able to maintain the structural integrity of the aircraft. So at that point, we're done with this module. And good news for you online students, there is no AeroSim module that covers this information. This is a PowerPoint presentation I put together because I thought it was important for you to understand concepts behind pressurization. To that end, if you're an online student, I am not going to be testing you over this information. Just go back over this. It's really good information. You'll be just tuck it back in the recesses of your brain somewhere so that when you finally get into the airlines, you'll have a better understanding of why we are really concerned about pressurization. So until then, all I have to say is I love my job. Glad to be here. Hope I can make it done.